She sat. She sipped. She vanished. Welcome to Fogged Clue. I am your host, Merin. Help grow this curious corner. Drop your location in the comments. You make this experience unforgettable every time. Let's begin the story. It had been raining since dawn. Not the sort of rain that makes itself known with thunder or downpour, but a thin, persistent drizzle. The kind that clung to coat collars and dulled the air until even the gas lamps seemed to flicker more slowly. Maigret stood at the window of his office, his pipe cradled in the corner of his mouth, unlit. He wasn't thinking about a case. He wasn't thinking at all. Across the street, the corner cafe was beginning to empty out its breakfast patrons. Men with newspapers folded under their arms stepped out under umbrellas or newspapers turned hats, while the waiters inside stacked chairs with the resigned gestures of people who'd done this for years. It was early March, which in Paris meant the cold was no longer sharp, but still not gone. A wet cold that got into the cuffs of your trousers and settled there like boredom. Madame Maigret had packed him a hard-boiled egg and a square of cheese for lunch. He'd seen her carefully wrap it in brown paper that morning, right after she'd scolded the grocer for trying to pass off yesterday's lettuce. Her voice had been low but firm as always, and he'd left the house with a smile he hadn't yet shaken. There was a knock at the door. Inspector Janvier came in without waiting for a reply, a habit Maigret allowed only because the man's presence didn't break the atmosphere. "There's nothing urgent, Chief," Janvier said, slipping off his hat and running a hand through hair that never quite stayed in place. "But there's a message from a waitress down in Montparnasse. She asked for you specifically." Maigret looked at him. She didn't say why, only that it was important, but not urgent. Her words. Maigret nodded once, still looking out the window. "I'll go," he said simply. There were no sirens, no urgency, but something about it. A waitress asking for him directly, with no name and no clear complaint, settled into him like a pebble in the bottom of a shoe. By the time he reached the café in Montparnasse, the rain had become little more than a suggestion in the air, the sort that made every wool coat smell faintly of damp tobacco. It was a narrow place, tucked between a tobacconist and a bookstore that seemed never open. The glass in the door was fogged up from the heat inside, and Maigret stood for a moment, letting his coat drip before stepping in. The interior was unremarkable. Formica tables, chipped sugar bowls, a row of hats on hooks by the door. A clock above the counter ticked audibly, out of rhythm with the jazz on the radio. Two old men were arguing about racing pigeons in a corner, their conversation looping in circles. No one noticed Maigret until the waitress approached. She was young, not more than 23, with nervous eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she held the edge of her apron. She didn't ask his name. She just gestured toward a booth near the back. She was sitting there, the girl said quietly. "Yesterday, same time, she ordered tea. Just tea." Maigret sat down, out of habit more than instruction. The cushion on the booth sighed under his weight. He waited. The waitress didn't sit. "She had this strange way about her," the girl continued. "Not foreign, not crazy, just off. She ordered tea and waited, kept looking at the door. Then she got up and left." Maigret lit his pipe at last, letting the smoke drift toward the yellow ceiling. "And?" he said. "She never paid." Maigret looked at her. The girl flushed. "I know it sounds silly, but she said she'd be back today. She said someone would be meeting her, but no one ever came." The inspector nodded slowly, glancing out the window, where the rain had picked up again, dancing against the panes like restless fingers. "What did she look like?" The waitress hesitated. "Plain, mousy hair, grey coat, no lipstick, but her eyes were sad, like she knew something terrible." Maigret's eyes drifted back to the empty booth across from him. "Did she say her name?" No. He let out a long breath through his nose. The cafe smelled of dishwater, wet wool, and something sweet that had long since burned. All right, he said at last, standing. If she returns, don't tell her you spoke to me. The girl nodded, relieved and uncertain all at once. Outside, the rain was steady now. Maigret didn't raise his collar. He walked slowly down the boulevard, pipe in hand, not thinking of the woman who ordered tea. Not exactly. But already, somewhere behind his ribs, the feeling had begun. That quiet, pulling sensation. The one he never trusted and always followed. The fog along the boulevard had thickened by the time Maigret reached the corner tobacconist. He ducked beneath the striped awning and stood for a moment, shielding his matches from the breeze as he relit his pipe. The tobacco had grown damp, tasted faintly of the rain. Still, the ritual helped him think. A woman who orders tea, says she'll return, then disappears. Not unusual on its own. Paris was full of people meeting and not meeting, promising and forgetting. But it wasn't the action that lingered with him. It was what the waitress had said. Her eyes were sad, like she knew something terrible. Maigret had learned not to dismiss things like that. Not because young waitresses were expert judges of character, but because sadness, the real kind, didn't always wait for invitations. It walked into cafes, rode buses, stood on balconies. Sometimes it ordered tea. He turned down a narrow side street, hands in his pockets. The precinct wasn't far, but he wasn't ready to return just yet. Instead, he wandered. Not aimlessly, never that, but with a kind of passive drift, letting the city show its face slowly, as it did best in the rain. He stopped at the newspaper kiosk and bought a copy of Le Matin. There was a story on the front page about a minor scandal in the ministry, some lost files, nothing serious. A dull week then, all the better. Back in his office, the heat was too high, as always. Maigret opened the window a crack and let the cold seep in while he sat, pipe now unlit, and read over the report forms stacked on his desk. None had anything to do with the girl in Montparnasse. He didn't expect them to. Still, he found himself writing a note in his pad. Café Le Printemps, 2:30 p.m. Woman, grey coat, ordered tea, did not return. He didn't add sad eyes. That part he'd remember. Janvier knocked again, this time holding a cup of lukewarm coffee and a raised eyebrow. Anything? Maigret shook his head. No case. Janvier smirked. And yet, here we are. They drank in silence for a few minutes. Rain tapped the glass. Did the girl give a description? Maigret nodded. Grey coat, no lipstick, mousy hair. No name, no payment. Could be nothing. Could be, Maigret agreed. But in his chest, the pebble hadn't moved. The next day, at precisely 2:30, Maigret was already seated at the same booth in Le Printemps. The waitress saw him and gave a brief, nervous smile. He didn't return it. He simply waited. The tea arrived, unasked for. A courtesy, or perhaps a gesture of shared curiosity. The door chimed twice, letting in gusts of wind and two pensioners arguing about bus routes. A delivery boy with a parcel. A young man with red eyes and ink-stained fingers. None of them sat at the booth across from him. By 3:30, the cafe had returned to its slow rhythm. The waitress was wiping down menus when Maigret stood. She didn't come. No. Did she speak to anyone else? The girl hesitated. There was a man. Tuesday. He sat outside but came in for a moment. Spoke to her briefly. I thought they were together, but he left before the tea came. What did he look like? She shrugged, embarrassed. Older than her. Dark coat. Quiet. That helps a great deal, Maigret said with no sarcasm. As he reached for his wallet, the girl stopped him. She left this, on the seat. It was a slip of paper, folded in quarters. Maigret unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was light, hesitant. "You will recognize me by the brooch. If I change my mind, I won't be back." No signature, no date, just that. He pocketed it, nodding once to the girl, and left. Back at the precinct, he showed the note to Janvier, who read it and frowned. "What brooch?" "Wasn't mentioned," Maigret replied. "You think she wrote this before or after she left?" "She wrote it to someone," Maigret said, settling into his chair. "That much is clear. But the someone wasn't the waitress. You? Number, I don't think she expected police." Janvier crossed his arms. "Then who?" Maigret didn't answer. Instead, he turned the note over, as if the ink might bleed through with more meaning. It didn't. He called the cafe later that evening. The girl hadn't seen the woman again, nor the man. No one else remembered anything. He waited until nightfall, then walked the neighborhood alone, not canvassing, not questioning, just walking, watching. At a corner grocer, he paused to ask the owner if a woman in a grey coat had come through. The man barely looked up from his tally sheet. "Every third woman in Montparnasse wears a grey coat," he muttered. Maigret nodded and left. The man wasn't wrong. On the third day, the woman returned. He wasn't at the cafe, not then. He was at the station, speaking with a man whose dog had turned up dead in suspicious circumstances. The call came from January. "She's back." Maigret was already on his feet before the sentence finished. When he arrived, the booth was empty. The waitress looked stricken. "She was here 5 minutes, ordered tea, sat down, then looked up and saw something, or someone, outside. She got up and left before the tea came." Maigret stared at the door. "Did she say anything?" The girl shook her head. "She left a tip." "How much?" "100-franc note." He blinked. That was no mistake. "She trying to apologize," the girl said quietly, "for wasting my time." "No," Maigret murmured. "She's trying to vanish without guilt." He turned and walked out into the rain again. This time he did raise his collar. She had come to say goodbye. But to whom? And why had she expected to be recognized? The pebble in Maigret's chest pressed harder now, not from pain, but from certainty. She was hiding from something, or someone, and she had just changed her mind again. That evening, Maigret sat alone at his kitchen table, the window behind him rattling faintly with the wind. Madame Maigret had already gone to bed, leaving him his usual slice of apple tart and a pot of weak tea. He hadn't touched either. The folded note from the cafe lay in front of him. He read it again, though he already knew it by heart. "You will recognize me by the brooch. If I change my mind, I won't be back." She had returned, then changed her mind again. Maigret's gaze shifted to the corner of the room, where his overcoat hung on the back of a chair. Somewhere in the lining, the smell of the cafe still lingered. Dishwater, cheap polish, and a faint floral perfume that didn't belong to the waitress. He could still see the curve of the teacup left untouched, the 100-franc note resting like a farewell. The brooch. She had wanted someone to recognize her by it. But whom? And why that method? He rose slowly, joints protesting, and fetched a notepad. On it, he began a list, though he did not yet know what it would yield. 1. Woman, 30s, grey coat, no lipstick, sad eyes. 2. Leaves note, ambiguous message. 3. Returns briefly, sees someone or something through cafe window 4. Leaves tip equals 100F. Intentional. Guilt or escape. 5. Mention of a brooch, meant as a signal. He added one final line. 6. Afraid of recognition, yet leaves herself open to it. Why? The contradiction sat uncomfortably with him. People who disappeared usually did so with care, not breadcrumbs. She'd made a point of being seen, even if only by the waitress. That meant she wanted to be found. Or perhaps, found only by the right person. He tapped his pen against the table. At 10:30, he called the night desk and asked Janvier to meet him early the next morning. By 8 o'clock, the drizzle had returned, softer now, like breath against glass. Janvier arrived with his usual scuffed shoes and a paper bag of croissants. He offered Maigret one wordlessly. Maigret accepted, but didn't eat. "We're going back to Montparnasse," he said. Janvier gave no protest. He never did when Maigret spoke like that, low and firm, as if he were following a thread only he could see. They arrived just after 9. The waitress was still on shift, tidying menus. "Did she speak to anyone yesterday?" Maigret asked. The girl shook her head. "Anyone follow her out?" She hesitated. "I don't know if he followed her, but a man came in just after she left. He looked around, didn't order anything, then walked out again." "Dark coat?" "Yes. Tall. Average. Maybe a little stooped." Maigret didn't move. "Was he wearing a hat?" "A cap. Not a proper hat." Janvier looked at Maigret. The inspector nodded once. They stepped back outside, under the low grey sky. "She's being watched," Maigret said quietly. Janvier lit une cigarette. "Think he's the same man from Tuesday?" "Possibly. Or another one, sent to be sure." "Sure of what?" "That she doesn't meet whoever she came here to meet." They began walking slowly toward the end of the street. At the tobacconist, Maigret bought another box of matches, not because he needed them, but because it gave him a moment to glance behind. No one was following them, not obviously. They moved on. By 10, they'd covered the block surrounding Le Printemps twice. No sign of the woman, no sign of the man. They stopped at a second cafe, darker and narrower, with oilcloth table covers and a brass rail dulled from age. Maigret ordered coffee. "She didn't leave her name," he murmured, half to himself. "No address, no contact, only the brooch." Janvier sipped his own drink, watching people pass in the street. A fruit seller shouting prices, a couple arguing about something small but bitter, a boy running to catch a bus. "We could ask the jeweler," Janvier offered. Maigret glanced at him. "There's a shop 2 streets down. I saw it earlier. They do. Brooches, pins, watch repair, old things." Maigret said nothing, but when he rose, Janvier did too. The jeweler was a man in his 60s with thick spectacles and a dusting of hair around the edges of his scalp. His hands were long and soft-looking, but the nails were blackened with polish and years of fiddling with brass. He didn't stand when they entered, simply looked up from his bench. "We're not here officially," Maigret said. The man nodded, unsurprised. "Have any customers been in lately asking about brooches? Not to buy, just inquiring? Maybe something left here a long time ago?" The jeweler scratched his cheek, frowning. "There was a woman, day before yesterday, late afternoon, small frame, brown coat, asked if I had an old piece. She described it exactly. Bronze, inlaid with 2 green stones. Said it used to belong to her mother." Maigret leaned forward. "Did she leave a name?" "Number. But she asked me to call a number if anyone else came looking for it." He fumbled in a drawer and produced a scrap of paper. The number was written in small, rounded script. Maigret took it, scanning it once. "Did you?" The jeweler hesitated. "No one's come asking, not yet." Maigret slipped the paper into his notebook. "If they do, call this number instead," he said, handing over his own card. The jeweler nodded, eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Back on the street, Maigret walked in silence. "She wants to be found," he said. "But she doesn't trust whoever she's running from, so she leaves signals only the right person would understand. She thinks they'll look for the brooch. Number she knows they will. Then who is she warning, or waiting for?" Maigret didn't answer, but a chill had begun to spread under his coat, not from the cold, but from something more unsettling. This wasn't just fear. It was a kind of farewell. The brooch, the café, the 100-franc note, they were breadcrumbs, yes, but not leading to safety. They led backward, to something done long ago. And now someone had remembered. They walked the rest of the block in silence, the street glistening with recent rain, the gutters echoing faintly as water curled around fallen leaves and cigarette butts. Maigret paused outside a shuttered bookstore and glanced again at the note from the jeweller's drawer. The phone number sat alone on the paper. No name, no address, just a narrow thread that somehow felt taut, as though pulled from both ends. He turned the paper over. Nothing. But it had the careful neatness of someone trying not to be noticed. Not a flourish, not a hesitation. It was a woman's hand, surely. Practical, private. She left the number, Maigret said, folding the slip again, but not her name. She wants to control how much of herself is seen. Janvier nodded slowly, pulling his collar up as the wind picked up again. She's trying to be found, but only by someone who knows the code. Maigret looked up at the dull sky, the clouds low and metallic. Or someone who remembers. That thought stuck with him as they made their way back toward the precinct. A case with no body, no report, no complainant, only memory. Hints left like fingerprints on a dusty frame. Nothing provable, nothing official. But she had come to Montparnasse. Twice. She had described a brooch, and she had written, "You will recognize me by it." The rest followed not from deduction but instinct, an instinct born of years watching people try to hide things long after the hiding had ceased to matter. Back at his desk, Maigret didn't sit. He remained standing, pipe in hand, gazing at the far wall as if it held something he hadn't noticed before. "What was it about the brooch?" he murmured aloud. Janvier, half listening, shrugged. "A signal. She said someone would know her by it." "Yes, but also a message. Not just 'I am here,' but 'I am still here.'" That brooch. It wasn't hers. She described it. Said it was her mother's. That may have been true. Or it may have been the kind of lie you tell when you're looking to be overheard. He crossed the room and opened a cabinet where old incident files were stored. Reports from years past, most unsolved, many closed due to lack of evidence, a few forgotten entirely. He flipped through them, one hand resting on his hip, the other tracing dates. "Do you remember," he asked Janvier without turning, "that case, maybe 7, 8 years ago, young woman found near the canal, coat missing, no ID?" Janvier furrowed his brow. "Wasn't there something about a stolen brooch? Bronze with green stones?" Maigret turned, a look of satisfaction playing at the corners of his mouth. "You do remember." January stood and came over. Maigret had already begun pulling the file, thin, brittle, yellowing at the edges. "Victim was never identified," Janvier said. "No family ever came forward. But the jewelry, the brooch, was noted missing. The coroner listed faint bruising around the throat, though it was dismissed as inconclusive. There wasn't enough evidence for murder." They spread the file out on the desk. There it was, July, 8 years prior. A young woman, estimated age 25 to 30, found floating near the Quai de la Râpée. No bag, no identification, clothing waterlogged and torn. The file had a grainy photograph of the body before recovery. Not much to see, but Maigret stared at it all the same. "She'd have been in her early 30s now," he said quietly. Janvier looked at the photo, then at Maigret. "You think the woman in Montparnasse is her?" "No," Maigret said. "I think the woman in Montparnasse knew her." A long silence settled between them. She was someone's sister, someone's friend, maybe someone's lover, and she disappeared. But no one came forward. Either they were afraid, or they had reasons. Not to. Janvier's eyes narrowed. "You think the woman in grey is trying to reopen it?" "Not exactly. I think she's trying to make peace with it. But someone else, Someone she thought might be watching doesn't want that peace. January sat heavily in the nearby chair. So what do we do? Maigret tapped the file. We look at who was questioned then. Anyone who might still be in the area. Anyone who might remember the brooch. Maybe even the original reporting officers. One of them was Lapointe, wasn't it? Janvier nodded, before he transferred to Marseille. Get him on the line, Maigret said. Ask if he remembers anything unusual, anything about the brooch, or someone hovering nearby, unwilling to speak. As Janvier moved to the phone, Maigret sat down at last, stretching his legs out slowly. He reached for the report again and read it more carefully this time. The notes from the scene, the coroner's remarks. A single line caught his eye. Hair was pulled from the scalp in places, possibly during struggle. But there had been no determination, no crime officially declared. The bruises around the neck were faint, the wounds too degraded by water. Still, there had been something odd. A café ticket in the coat pocket, half dissolved, bearing the name of a place Maigret recognized. Not Le Printemps, but one street away, close enough to smell the coffee. Lapointe's voice came over the receiver, crackling through distance. Yes, I remember her, he said. The girl from the canal. I always felt we missed something. No one claimed her. But there was a man who came by the station 3 days later. Didn't ask directly about the case. Just sat in the waiting area. Left without giving his name. I only remember because he left a cigarette burning on the chair. One of those strong Balkan brands. Rare. Maigret looked at Janvier and raised a brow. What about a brooch? He asked into the receiver. Lapointe paused. Yes. There was something. A jeweler called in. Said a woman came asking about a piece that fit the description. That was the day before we found the body. Maigret closed his eyes. 8 years, still smouldering like the cigarette on that chair. The woman in grey wasn't revisiting a case. She was walking a memory back to the surface, hoping someone, the right someone, would meet her there. But the wrong someone had seen her first. The Balkan cigarette. Maigret turned the phrase over in his mind as he stepped outside for air. The drizzle had become a fine mist, clinging to his cheeks and coat like breath on glass. That detail, such a small thing, a forgotten cigarette on a waiting room chair, but it lived on in Lapointe's memory. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was wrong, out of place. He lit his own pipe and leaned against the damp iron railing outside the station. Across the street, a man passed with a baguette tucked beneath his arm, his hat pulled low. A tram clattered somewhere in the distance, muffled by the damp. It was the kind of weather that made the city fold in on itself. Quiet, introspective, fitting perhaps. He stayed there a while, watching, thinking, not trying to solve anything, and not yet, but letting the details settle. The woman, the brooch, the reappearance, the man in the cap, and the connection to the old case, the one that had never sat right. A woman drowned, a brooch gone, a cafe ticket dissolving in her coat. All of it quiet, subdued, half erased by time. He returned inside, where Janvier had spread a copy of the old case files across the desk. Lapointe's going to check the logs from that week, Janvier said. See if anything was ever noted about the man who came in. Maigret nodded absently. His eyes were already fixed on something in the file. A name, scribbled in the corner of a statement. "Who's this?" he asked, tapping the paper. Janvier leaned in. Gérard Lemoine, owner of a boarding house near the canal. He said he recognized the victim. Thought she'd stayed a night or two about a month before the drowning. Gave a vague description. Nothing solid. He was never followed up on, far as I can see. Maigret reached for his coat again. Let's go see Monsieur Lemoine. The boarding house sat on a side street that smelled of old brick and cabbage. Its shutters were half closed, the paint flaking in strips, the doorbell cracked but still functional. Maigret pressed it once. A long pause, and then slow, deliberate footsteps descended the interior stairs. Gérard Lemoine answered the door in a wool vest and slippers, blinking behind thick spectacles. His hair was white and curling at the edges, and he had the particular look of a man who had never quite trusted visitors. "I'm not taking lodgers," he said at once. Maigret showed his badge. "We're not looking for a room. We're following up on a case from some years ago. You spoke to the police about a young woman who may have stayed here before. An accident near the canal." Lemoine narrowed his eyes. "That was years ago." "Yes? But you said she looked familiar. Lived here a short while?" The man frowned. "She wasn't the only one. People come and go, especially in summer. Students, travelers." "Do you keep guest books?" Lemoine's mouth twitched. "I used to." He gestured for them to come inside. The lobby was dim, walls stained from old leaks, a single coat rack sagging under the weight of discarded umbrellas. He led them to a small back office, cluttered with ledgers and receipts, the air thick with dust. From a drawer, he produced a thick ledger and laid it on the desk. Maigret flipped slowly through the entries, rows of names, dates, occasionally crossed out or rewritten. "There," Janvier said, pointing. "Mid-June, El Fournier." Maigret looked at Lemoine. "That name ring a bell?" The man hesitated. "Could be. I don't remember her face. But the name... Yes, I think she was quiet. Kept to herself. Paid in cash. And this?" Maigret pointed to a note beside the entry. "B, upstairs." "That was the room," Lemoine said. "Top floor. Shared bath. Faces the alley." "Anyone else staying upstairs at the time?" Lemoine flipped back a few pages. "Yes. A man, Jean Vervet. Stayed on and off that summer. Worked at the port. Used to smoke those foul Balkan cigarettes." Maigret and Janvier locked eyes. "Do you have a forwarding address?" Janvier asked. Lemoine shrugged. "Doubt it. He disappeared end of that summer. Owed me 3 days' rent." Maigret stared at the page. "If we gave you a photograph," he asked, "could you try to confirm if this was the same man?" "Possibly." Outside, the mist had thickened into a fine rain. They stepped into it quietly, neither man speaking at first. Then Maigret lit his pipe again and said, "He knew her. That much is clear. The Balkan cigarettes, the timing. He was upstairs when she stayed. And then he vanished. No trace." Janvier's face was tense. "You think he killed her?" Maigret exhaled slowly. "I think he knew what happened. Maybe he watched it happen. Maybe he let it happen." They returned to the precinct and began the slow, deliberate process of checking port records, housing rolls, and any trace of a Jean Vervet. There was little. A worker's badge filed under a variation of the name, Vervet, J.P., noted at a shipping yard in Le Havre. But the record ended there. No further details, no photograph. That evening, Maigret called the jeweler again. The man picked up on the first ring. "Has anyone come in today?" "No," he said. "Quiet all day." "Good. If anyone does, note the time and call us immediately." He gave the number again. Slower this time. After he hung up, Maigret returned to his desk, sat down, and stared at the photo from the canal file once more. Not at her face, which was obscured by the water's haze, but at her hands. Delicate, one wrist faintly swollen. And then he remembered something else. "Janvier," he said quietly, "do you still have that medical record from the case?" Janvier handed it over. There it was, a line nearly lost in the margins. Traces of bronze oxidation on right collarbone, matching outline of jewelry not found on body. Maigret tapped it twice. She wore the brooch when she died. Janvier swallowed. Then someone took it, after. Maigret nodded. "And now someone's returned to ask about it, to offer recognition, or forgiveness, but the brooch isn't a memory." He looked toward the rain-beaded window. "It's evidence." The idea of the brooch as evidence, not symbol, shifted something in Maigret. It no longer felt like a trail of sentimental crumbs, but the careful placement of a match, struck only when necessary. The woman in grey, whoever she truly was, hadn't returned to the cafe in mourning. She'd come to test something, to set something in motion. He sat back and lit his pipe again, the first draw bitter from having burned low. The smoke curled toward the ceiling, vanishing before it met the cracked plaster. He stared at it without blinking. "Let's assume," he said to Janvier, who was still hunched over the file, "that she didn't want to be recognized by us. She wasn't reaching for justice in the way most people do. She left a brooch behind, or a memory of it. She wanted someone to see it and remember, but not us, someone else." Janvier looked up slowly. "Vervet," Maigret nodded. "Or someone like him, whoever took the brooch, whoever visited the station years ago, then vanished." Janvier stood, restless. He poured 2 coffees from the pot, one too full, one barely warm, and handed Maigret the latter. "We can't even prove he existed," he muttered. "If not for the cigarettes and the scribble in the ledger, he's a shadow." Maigret sipped and grimaced. Shadows don't walk into cafes. They don't watch through windows. That stuck with both of them. The next morning, Maigret returned to Le Printemps just before opening. The waitress was already preparing tables, folding napkins with habitual care. She looked surprised to see him. "Still nothing," she said before he spoke. "I'm not waiting for her," Maigret said. "I'm waiting for the one who followed her." He sat in the same booth, hands flat on the table, not reading, not drinking, just watching. The regulars came and went. A butcher stopped for black coffee. A young woman nursed a chocolate with too much whipped cream. But no one lingered near the booth. No one looked inside through the fogged glass. He left at 11 and circled the block. Nothing. The jeweler hadn't seen anyone either. The number on the slip of paper remained silent. If it had ever rung, it hadn't rung here. By midday, Janvier had tracked down a former dock supervisor from the port registry, a wiry man with blunt fingers and a suspicious squint. They met him in a corner cafe near the Bastille. "Vervet?" the man said, after Maigret asked the question. "Maybe. There was a Jean something back then. Quiet type. Kept to himself. Slept on site sometimes. Got into a fight over a cigarette once that I remember. Do you recall if he had an accent? Not strong. Could have been from the east. Vosges, maybe. Did he leave suddenly?" The man shrugged. "Everyone left suddenly. Back then, no one stayed long. He just stopped showing up." "Did he leave anything behind?" The man smirked. "A coat, couple of bad books, nothing worth keeping." Back at the precinct, Maigret sifted again through the old photographs from the canal case. Most were procedural, clinical, but one had been taken wider, unintentionally capturing the far end of the bank. A figure, indistinct, was walking, away in the background, possibly male, possibly not, but there was a line in the stance, the droop of the shoulders, the forward lean, that felt familiar. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said, "Get the photo developed again. Bigger. See if we can sharpen the background." Janvier hesitated. "It's years old." Maigret didn't blink. "Try anyway." That evening the jeweler called. "She was here," he said, his voice low. Maigret sat upright. "When?" "Half an hour ago. I didn't call immediately. She asked me not to. She left this time, differently. She seemed finished." "Did she say anything?" "She asked if anyone else had asked about the brooch." "And you told her?" "I said no, which is true." "Did she leave anything?" A pause. "Yes, she gave me the brooch." Maigret stood, already reaching for his coat. "Don't touch it. I'm coming now." The shop was empty when he arrived. The jeweler locked the door behind him and brought out a velvet pouch, stained and creased. He set it gently on the glass counter and opened it. The brooch was small, bronze, two green stones set in delicate curls of metal. The patina showed age, but the catch was intact. Maigret didn't touch it. He stared. She said it no longer mattered who had it, the jeweler murmured. Only that someone else could see it. Maigret looked at him. See it or remember it? The jeweler didn't answer. The inspector left with the brooch sealed in a paper envelope. At the precinct, he laid it beside the coroner's note, the greenish trace of oxidized metal found on the victim's collarbone. The outline matched perfectly. She kept it, he said aloud. All this time, she kept the brooch until now. Janvier frowned. Then why give it up now? Because she wanted it seen, Maigret replied. Not for herself, for him, or for whoever did this. She doesn't need it anymore. Janvier leaned against the window. Do you think she's afraid of him? After all these years? Maigret shook his head slowly. I think she stopped being afraid some time ago. What she is now is tired. He sat again, the envelope still on the desk. The question isn't whether he'll come, he said. It's whether he'll know that we're watching when he does. The next morning, the sky over Paris remained the same stubborn grey, as though even the sun had agreed to stay out of sight until something quietly resolved itself. Maigret arrived at the precinct early, before the stove had warmed the air, and sat down at his desk without removing his coat. The envelope with the brooch was still there, untouched, sealed with 2 pieces of thick tape. It seemed to radiate silence. Not mystery exactly. Something quieter. Regret, perhaps. He stared at it while the building slowly came to life around him. Janvier arrived 10 minutes later, eyes red from too little sleep, 2 coffees in. Hand. He set one beside Maigret and nodded toward the brooch. No word from her. Maigret shook his head. No word. And I don't think there will be. You think she's gone for good? She left the brooch, Maigret said quietly. That was her final gesture. If she'd meant to come back, she'd have held on to it. He lit his pipe and leaned back. It was never meant for us, Janvier. It was meant for him. But now he knows it's passed out of her hands. That changes the shape of things. Janvier nodded, but he didn't speak. A short time later, the enlarged photograph from the old canal case arrived, the one Maigret had asked to have blown up. The figure in the background, while still grainy, was more distinct now, tall, narrow-shouldered, with a dark coat and the suggestion of a cap. One hand in the pocket, the other hanging loose, holding something, possibly a cigarette, possibly not. No facial detail, but the posture felt unmistakable. Maigret stared at it for a long time. He watched, he said finally. He stood there, not rushing, not fleeing. He walked away, but slowly. Like he knew no one would stop him, Janvier added. Or like he believed no one would understand what he'd done, not right away. They put the photo aside and began digging again. Port records, old tenant ledgers, even border entries. No solid trace of Jean Vauvet. It was as though the man had unspooled himself from the world shortly after that summer. By midday, Maigret made a decision. I want someone posted at Le Printemps, he said. Unmarked, quiet, not to stop anyone, just to observe. You think he'll come? I think he's come before, and he'll want to know what we've done with the brooch. That afternoon, the plainclothes officer, Lucas, dependable, discreet, took position across from the cafe. Maigret gave strict instructions, no contact unless absolutely necessary. Just eyes. The hours passed, the rain didn't fall, but the sky pressed lower. By evening, Lucas called in. A man came by around 5, he said. Didn't enter the cafe, looked through the window, just for a moment, then walked on. Describe him. Mid-50s maybe, wore a cap, long grey coat, limped slightly, left leg, didn't speak to anyone. Did you follow him? Yes. He turned off toward the canal, but I lost him near Pont d'Austerlitz. He was deliberate, not fast, but not easy to tail. Maigret closed his eyes for a moment. Next time, don't follow. Just note the time. He hung up and returned to the window. The brooch still sat on the desk. Quiet, heavy. That night, he slept badly. He dreamed of women walking into fog and never returning, of a brooch floating in dark water, of a man watching from a bridge and not moving even as the sirens came. The next morning, he found a letter waiting for him at the station. No return address. Plain envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar but careful, like someone trying to imitate calm. Inside was a single sentence, written in blue ink. You have the brooch. That should be enough. No signature. Janvier read it over his shoulder. That came through post? Dropped at the front desk. No one saw who left it. They both stared at it. You think it's him? I think it's someone who knows what the brooch means, Maigret said, and someone who hopes we'll take silence as closure. Janvier paced to the window. But he hasn't confessed. He hasn't come forward. He won't. Not unless something pushes him. Her? She's gone, and she won't return. Maigret stood and reached for his coat. But there's still the brooch, and that means there's still a line he can't control. He returned to the jeweler one last time that afternoon, carrying the envelope. The man looked surprised to see him. She came to you with this, Maigret said, placing it on the counter. Why? The jeweler hesitated. She said it was safe here. Why not the police? She didn't trust that you would understand what it meant. Did she say anything else? The jeweler looked away. Only that she'd once seen it in someone else's hands, someone who no longer had the right to it. Maigret nodded slowly. Thank you. When he returned to the precinct, he placed the brooch in evidence, filed the note, and recorded everything. But he knew there would be no charges, no arrest, nothing to tie a man whose name might not even be real to a woman who was never claimed, no clear line from the brooch to the canal. What remained was wait and silence. That evening, as Maigret walked home under a sky that threatened snow, he passed a woman in a grey coat near the market. For a moment, his breath caught, the profile, the posture. But she turned, and it was not her. She had vanished again. But this time, not in fear. This time, she had left something behind. Not a name, not a story, just a brooch, and the certainty that someone else would carry the memory of what had been done, even if no one would ever speak it aloud. The snow did not fall that night, but it came close. By morning, a fine frost clung to the sidewalks like powdered sugar, and Maigret's breath clouded before him as he walked toward the precinct. It was quiet, the kind of quiet particular to cold days in the city, when people moved less and spoke softer, as though the air might freeze their voices mid-sentence. He entered through the side door and nodded at the clerk on duty, who gave him a quick "Morning, Chief," before returning to a file half read. The building was still waking. He preferred it that way. On his desk, the envelope with the brooch was gone, filed in evidence the day before, locked in a cabinet that felt far too clean for the weight it now held. But something else waited in its place. Another envelope. This one thinner, cheaper. No name, no seal. Only a slight smudge on the corner where a thumb had held it too tightly. He opened it slowly. Inside, a photograph, old, yellowed, a woman seated on a park bench, not smiling, but not sad either. Neutral, perhaps, watchful. Her coat was open, a brooch just visible near her collarbone. The same brooch. Maigret had no doubt. There was no message, just the photo. Janvier stepped in with coffee, noticed the photograph, and paused. Where did that come from? Maigret shook his head. Left at the desk. Again, no one saw. Janvier looked at it closer. That's her, the woman from the canal. No, Maigray's voice was calm. That's her sister, or friend, or someone who loved her enough to keep this, someone who's now finished looking back. He held the photo between thumb and forefinger. This picture is years old. Someone kept it all this time, carried it, until now. Janvier sat without speaking. She's given us everything she had, Maigret went on. The brooch, the message, the past. What she couldn't give, or wouldn't, was the name. Because naming it makes it a case, Janvier said. A crime. Maigret nodded slowly. And maybe she couldn't bear that. Or maybe she thought we'd never understand it the way she did. That it wasn't justice she wanted. Just remembrance. He slipped the photo into a folder and tucked it beside the report. They had no new witnesses, no confession, no suspect. But they had a timeline now, built in reverse. A body, a brooch, a man who disappeared, a woman who came back. The outline of a story that refused to be pinned down. And then, just before noon, the call came in. Lucas, still stationed across from the cafe, his voice unusually tense. He came back. Maigret didn't need to ask who. He didn't go inside, just stood across the street, same spot, looked through the glass for several minutes, then turned and walked away again, toward the canal. Maigret grabbed his coat. Do not follow. Just tell me the direction. South, along the quay. I think he's going to the same place. Maigret moved quickly, but without haste, coat collar high, pipe unlit in one hand. Janvier joined him, wordlessly matching his pace. They walked along the Seine, the buildings still damp from the morning frost, the city still holding its breath. At the foot of the Pont d'Austerlitz they saw him, mid-50s, as described, grey coat, cap, slight limp. He stood near the edge of the water, not too close, hands in pockets, staring out, not moving, not hiding. He turned slightly as they approached, but didn't run, didn't speak. Maigret stopped a few steps away. Janvier held back. The man's eyes were tired, not afraid but resigned, his face pale from the cold. Inspector, he said, voice rough with cold or disuse. You found it. Maigret didn't reply. He waited. The man turned back to the water. I didn't push her. Still, Maigret said nothing. She wanted to leave. I thought she would. She was standing on the embankment when I arrived, crying, said she couldn't go back, that it didn't matter anymore. Maigret took one step closer. And the brooch? The man hesitated. She dropped it. I picked it up. I don't know why. I should have left it, but it was hers. I thought... His voice trailed off. She meant for someone to know, Maigret said gently. The man nodded. I've carried it ever since. But I didn't keep it as a prize. It was a weight. She never screamed. She never asked for help. She just looked at me and I couldn't do anything. And the woman at the cafe? Maigret asked. He didn't flinch. Her sister, younger. She blamed herself too, I think. For not seeing the signs, for not stopping her. She came back when she heard someone had reopened the case. You? I didn't say a word. I only watched. But when I saw her there, she wore the same coat. I thought it was her for a second, like time hadn't moved. Maigret's voice was soft now. Why didn't you come forward sooner? The man closed his eyes. Because there was no way to explain not saving someone, no law for cowardice, and no one wanted guilt. They wanted guilt proven. A long silence passed. Maigret lit his pipe, the smoke rising between them. We're not going to arrest you, he said at last. There's no evidence, no charge. The man nodded once, almost imperceptibly. But we will keep the brooch, Maigret added, and the photograph, in the file. Good, the man said. Someone should remember her. Maigret turned and began walking back. Janvier joined him. Neither spoke for some time. Back at the precinct, Maigret returned to his office and placed the photograph and the letter beside the original report. He didn't add much, just a few lines in his own hand. Not about guilt, not about crime, just the facts, quiet and spare. And when he closed the file, he sat for a long time at his desk, listening to the stillness of the station. The snow had begun to fall at last. The snow was falling softly now, slow and dry, the kind that turned the stone corners of Paris into something almost gentle. From the high window in his office, Maigret watched it drift past the lamplight and settle on the sloped roofs across the street, where cats used to walk in summer. Everything moved more slowly in the snow. People stepped carefully. Time, too, seemed to pause, as if the city, in silence, offered space for unfinished thoughts. He turned back to the file on his desk, the old one from the canal. The victim had never been named. The original case had sat unopened for nearly a decade, and now, after a woman had returned briefly from the edges of memory, and a man had stood again at the edge of the water, it was full again. Not with closure. Maigret didn't believe in that, but with shape. There had been no confession, no charge filed. But what had emerged was something heavier than guilt. It was memory, quietly stubborn, resisting disappearance. In the end, the woman in grey had not asked for justice. She had asked only that someone see, that someone remember. She had left the brooch not as a weapon, but as a relic, the final piece of a vanished name. Janvier knocked once and entered without waiting. "She really is gone," he said. "Left the city. We checked the guest house she'd stayed at. Paid in cash, no forwarding address, nothing left behind." Maigret nodded slowly, unsurprised. She did what she came to do. Janvier hesitated. And him? He won't return to the café. He won't write again. But he'll live with it. That's the only sentence he'll carry, and the only one that matters. Janvier didn't speak for a moment. Then he sat, resting his hands on his knees, like a boy unsure whether to ask a question. "Do you think she came back to punish him?" Maigret took a long draw on his pipe before answering. "Number, I think she came back to forgive him. But not aloud, not directly. She left the brooch, yes, but only after she saw him watching. She wanted him to see her as she remembered her sister, to know that she remembered him too, that she hadn't forgotten." "And the photo?" Janvier asked. Maigret smiled faintly without humour. "She gave us what she could. Maybe so we'd remember too. Or maybe just so it wouldn't all vanish." They sat in silence as the snow outside thickened. Later that afternoon, Maigret walked the short distance to the Quai de la Râpée. The river ran dark and slow beneath the bridge. He paused at the exact spot where the body had once been found, near the rusted mooring post with the chipped red paint. A small memory of a crime almost invisible. A woman, standing alone, had once waited there. She'd said little, cried softly, left no note. But her absence had echoed in two lives for years, until one returned and the other watched from shadows. Maigret didn't believe in justice as a clean thing. Most truths were partial, most crimes soaked into time like water into wood, leaving only softened edges and uncertain outlines. But he believed in listening and in waiting. He believed in the weight of silence, the power of presence. He watched the water for a long time, then turned and walked back toward the station. The snow was deeper now, lacing gutters and balconies, blurring the edges of chimneys. Paris seemed to breathe differently under snow, softer, older, almost kind. Maigret stopped at a newspaper stand, not for headlines, but out of habit. He bought a paper and folded it under his arm. Back at his desk, the photograph waited, as did the quiet brooch in its envelope. He placed both gently in the file, wrote a final note, only a few lines, nothing dramatic, and closed it for good. He did not mark the case solved. He simply wrote, in his Small, round script. No one disappeared. She was remembered. He turned out the light and stepped into the hallway, where the scent of coffee and floor polish drifted up from the lower floors. Somewhere, someone laughed. A brief sound, quickly hushed. A desk drawer slammed. Typewriter keys clicked. Life returned to its normal rhythm. Outside, beneath the softening sky, the city went on. Maigret walked home slowly, not thinking about the brooch, or the woman, or the man who had watched. He thought instead about memory, how some things were carried quietly, how others returned only once, and how rarely a second chance arrived without being asked for. And when he reached his apartment, and Madame Maigret opened the door with her usual gentle frown, half concern, half welcome, he smiled as if nothing heavy had passed between 1 week and the next. Because in the end, nothing had changed, and everything had. A brooch had surfaced. A silence had broken. And someone, somewhere, would always remember. The snow lingered for 2 more days, melting slowly into the seams of the city, running down drain pipes and collecting in shallow puddles that reflected weak morning skies. Life resumed its steady hum. The cafes reopened their windows, laundry lines reappeared between balconies, and in the precinct, new cases arrived with the same scrawled urgency as ever. But Maigret remained still. He sat at his desk, the old file now tucked away in the cabinet behind him. Not forgotten, but finished, as much as such things ever were. The brooch, the photograph, the statement from the man at the river. All stored, all recorded. No arrests, no charges, no newspaper headlines. Just a quiet weight lifted, like a long-held breath finally released. Still, a final detail remained. Something had continued to trouble him, not as a gap in logic, but as a human knot, tight and small and out of sight. He turned it over now as he watched the frost fade from the corners of the window. It wasn't the brooch, nor the body, nor even the man who watched and failed to act. It was the photograph, not the one left at the station, but what it implied. He opened the drawer again, pulled out the envelope. The photograph showed a woman seated on a park bench, coat folded open, the brooch clearly visible. But the photograph was not new. That much was obvious. The paper was old, the colors muted. It had been taken years ago. Yet the woman in the cafe, the one who returned, who left the brooch with the jeweler, had not aged quite enough. Maigret lit his pipe slowly, one hand resting against the desk. He looked again. What if it wasn't her sister? The resemblance was strong, yes, but too strong. Her mannerisms, her posture, the timbre of her voice, all of it had struck him, unconsciously, as too close to the unnamed woman from the canal. It explained the confusion, the hesitation from the jeweler, the fear in the man who watched from the street. Everyone saw the same thing. But what if it was the same woman? He sat back, pipe resting between his fingers. What if the girl from the canal hadn't died? What if they had been wrong? He stood abruptly, crossed to the cabinet, and opened the old case file. The autopsy had never confirmed identity. There had been no fingerprints, no dental records, no family claims. Just a body, bloated from water, facial features obscured. The brooch had been missing. A cafe ticket, a presumed narrative. But what if someone else had been wearing her coat that night? A friend, a lodger, a woman who had borrowed something, or been mistaken for someone else, perhaps even lured to that spot. The bruising had been faint, the cause of death ambiguous. She might have drowned accidentally, or been mistaken for someone she wasn't. And what if the real woman, the one they all believed had died, had watched it happen? What if she had fled, not from guilt, but from being blamed? He stared out the window. It would explain everything. The silence, the reappearance, the way she had circled the case without ever stepping fully into it. The way she'd watched from the cafe, waiting for recognition, not trying to solve a mystery, but to see whether the past had truly faded, whether someone still remembered her, as herself or as the dead. It would explain the brooch, too. Not a token left in mourning, but an offering, a way of saying, "You mistook me once. Here is the piece you missed." He tapped the pipe out gently. Janvier entered a moment later, coat dusted with melting snow. "Anything?" he asked. Maigret didn't answer immediately. He gestured to the folder. "What if we were wrong from the beginning?" he said. "What if the woman in the canal wasn't who we thought?" Janvier's brow furrowed. "Then who was she?" Maigret shook his head slowly. "That's the piece we'll never know. She had no name, just a borrowed coat, and someone else's fate." Janvier leaned against the wall. "And the woman who came back?" "She wasn't haunted by what someone did to her," Maigret said softly. "She was haunted by what was done in her name." He stood now, brushing the ash from his sleeve. "She returned to give it back, not just the brooch, but the story. She didn't want to carry it anymore." Janvier was quiet for a long time. "And what do we do with that?" Maigret gave a small, tired smile. "Nothing. We file the report. We keep the brooch. And we remember that sometimes the truth doesn't reveal itself through answers, but through what no one dares to ask." Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was beginning to pale, a soft strip of blue opening over the rooftops. The river would be moving slowly now, no longer burdened by frost or by ghosts. Maigret took his coat, nodded once to Janvier, and stepped out into the thaw. He had no intention of looking for her. She had already said everything she needed to say, in silence, in gesture, in memory, and for once, that was enough. 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 That was enough.